Hello everyone. Today we're going to talk about arguments for and against the existence of God, and I want to go through the ontological argument and replies made to it, and then the cosmological argument and replies made to that. In the ontological argument by St. Anselm, this Benedictine monk who lived from 1033 to 1109, he tries to do what his fellow monks had asked him to do, namely to give a proof that doesn't depend on Scripture. After all, you can't use the book to prove the book, you have to go outside of it. And so they wanted a rational proof, not based in natural theology as opposed to revealed theology, if you will, arguments instead of faith. And so he starts out with a definition of God in this argument, as you may know. He starts out by saying, even if you argue against God, you must at least know what you're arguing against, so you have to have a definition of what you're arguing against. If you were to say, for example, there are no squares, you'd have to say, well, there are no four-sided figures with 360 degrees in their internal angles. That would be the strategy. So here, too, he starts out with a definition. And God is a being than which none greater can be thought. A being than which none greater can be thought. Sometimes he says a being than which none greater can be conceived. So if that is the being that we're going to talk about, he then says there's a fool, the skeptic, and he has this from Psalms, and the fool says in his heart there is no God. But Anselm says this same fool understands what I'm saying, even if he does not understand it to exist. So he'll allow at least this fool, the skeptic, and there'd be the fool, imagine him in the religious community too, someone who's doubtful. This same fool at least understands what the words mean, a being than which none greater can be thought. But if he understands those words, and if they're in his understanding, Anselm says, in his mind that is, then he cannot turn around and say, such a being does not exist. Anselm will go on to say that's internally contradictory. That would be a bit like saying triangles don't have 180 degrees in their internal angles, their interior angles, which would be contradictory. The definition of a triangle is that it has 180 degrees in its interior angle. So you can't then say that there is a being than which none greater can be thought, and this being doesn't exist. Anselm says if it is a being than which none greater can be thought, i.e. the greatest conceivable being, GCB, as scholars use it these days, if we're talking about GCB, one of its attributes of being the greatest is that it must exist. Because if it didn't exist, then there would be one greater. But there can't be one greater than the greatest. So this, if it is indeed the greatest conceivable being that we're entertaining the thought of, then it follows necessarily that this being must exist. That's a pretty economical argument. It's as if Anselm has defined God into existence. He takes this from Euclid's geometry. Euclid, he has a notion, at least from Euclid's geometry, some 15 centuries before. Euclid started out with postulates, and on the basis of those postulates deduces proofs. You remember your days in geometry. Well, Anselm is rather envious of that, and as a rationalist philosopher in the tradition of Plato and Augustine, he thinks if we have one bold starting point, God is the greatest conceivable being, then we can deduce the rest of the argument. It's a pure argument, doesn't depend upon experience or anything we sense. It's mathematical almost in its elegance. If you start with this idea of a supreme being, a being than which none greater can be thought. He doesn't use the word supreme, leave that to other people, Descartes and others who call it supreme or perfect. If you start out with that bold stroke, then his existence must follow. Alright, well, there have been some replies made to that. One was made by Guanello, a Italian bishop who was a contemporary, who said, well, if that's true, then I can conceive of the greatest island, and that must exist. To make a long story short, Anselm says, no, I wasn't talking about material things like islands, which can't be the greatest. They may be the greatest of their kind, greatest as an island, but there's no necessity in their existing because they are just these finite things. No matter how great the island is that you're imagining, it doesn't, the imagination of it doesn't imply its existence. David Hume said, in effect, that we can't make an illicit transition from the realm of ideas to reality. We can't say that just because we think of a being than which none greater can be thought that that being must exist. Hume says anything we can imagine to exist, we can imagine not to exist. Cats, dogs, you, me, we didn't have to exist. We're, as Aristotle would call us, contingent beings. So the negation of the sentence God exists would be God doesn't exist, and there's nothing internally contradictory about that. We've spent time talking about Hume and his analytic statements. So it's not analytic to say God exists, nor is it observable by any sense perception that God exists. So according to Hume, it's nonsense. It doesn't count as knowledge if it's neither analytic nor synthetic. Kant has a different tact. The German philosopher who lived from 1724 to 1804, whose empiricism and rationalism combined we just looked at, says in effect that existence is not a predicate. So he says that if you imagine a lemon and describe the lemon, let's say, as yellow and firm and bitter, and let's say 3 inches high and 2 inches across, you don't then say, oh, and it exists. Existence is not a predicate. You can predicate yellowness, firmness, bitterness of the lemon and fill in its attributes that way, but then it's a different kind of claim to say, oh, it exists. The existence claim does not follow from its attributes. So in Kant's pithy rendering, existence is not a predicate. It's a different order of claim to make an existential claim about something. Still, Anselm's argument does not die. I think Anselm is famous for this one paragraph that he wrote in the Proslogian, after he wrote the Monologian, and he over several chapters of the Proslogian he argues for God's existence, and it still resonates to this day. If not for this argument, people would not read Anselm. But he is in that tradition of it's Plato, Augustine, Anselm, and then we go to Descartes and Spinoza and Leibniz, these great rationalists that cover 2,000 years. The idea that we can have these ideas through thought alone, it's a priori. God's existence is a priori. You can generate a proof just by the mere consideration. It's a conceptual proof, if you will. It's based on concepts alone. If you have the right concept of God, it will follow that he exists. So you have Anselm and his replies. The other argument that you have, this one generated by St. Thomas Aquinas, the Dominican friar who lived from 1225 to 1274, born in Aosta, Italy. Aquino, Italy. Aosta was Anselm. Aquinas has the cosmological argument, his second argument, which any cosmological argument is based on the cosmos or world order. And he says that when we observe final causes, intermediate causes, and first causes, this is language borrowed from Aristotle's physics, he says if you look at final causes, that is to say something in existence now, take the Empire State Building, the Empire State Building must have had a cause, the architect, the materials that went into it and so forth. There are multiple causes, and those are the causes. The architect is an intermediate cause, and who caused the architect? His parents. And who caused them? Their parents. And you can trace backwards this chain of causation, and these would be from this final cause, something in existence now, the Empire State Building still in existence in 2020, you can trace back to these intermediate causes. But, Aquinas says in the course of that argument, you can't go on indefinitely. There must be a first cause. You can't have an infinite series, in other words. You can't have an infinite regress of causes. Aquinas holds to the idea there must have been a first cause. And this first cause, he ends the argument in a quaint expression, this we call God. So the child's question would be, who caused God? And Aquinas would reply, God is uncaused. God is the uncaused cause. He caused the existence of material reality, but no one in turn caused him, and he has to say that. He can't say that God was caused and came into existence on such and such a date, because that would make God finite and also make him dependent for his existence on that of another. Can't say that. So in this chess game, he must say that there had to be this first cause. And now, you have the usual suspects replying, typically usually David Hume. David Hume's skill in counter-argument is perhaps second to none. Socrates was awfully good with counter-argument too, but David Hume surely is. And Hume says that there's a problem with this, several problems with this argument. Even if the conclusion follows, Hume says that from the chain of causation, there is a first cause that started the whole process. Hume would say that this God, there's no proof that this God is the Christian God, a all-knowing, all-powerful, all-good God, a God who answers to prayers, who's a loving God. Could be matter. It could be energy. It needn't be the God worshipped by the monotheistic tradition, the Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition. That's one problem. Also, Hume says, why isn't it possible that there would be an infinite series of causes? Why couldn't causality just go on indefinitely? He sees no urgency to pick a first point. So that's a problem. He says we only have limited inspection of cause and effect, so we can't say that all effects had causes. We can only look at the effects that we know and say that they had causes, but we can't say that they all did. So Hume, 1776, this Scottish philosopher, as usual, is puncturing these arguments for the existence of God in Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion, a book published after he died. The other arguments against the cosmological argument would take us into contemporary science. If you look at the Big Bang Theory from the 1920s and it replaced the steady state theory, the idea of the Big Bang Theory is that matter always existed. And the first existing beings, gases, hydrogen, oxygen, they collected together into this super dense fiery atom, and so dense that it exploded. And this postulate is used to explain the expansion of the universe that we can now observe. There had to be a primal explosion that caused this expansion. Why else would the universe be expanding? So that argues that we don't need to explain a first cause. We don't need to have God, that matter is a kind of eternal thing. Of course, Aquinas would say, where did the gases come from? If everything we know of came into existence, cats, dogs, houses, etc., they all had a cause, and they are the effects of those causes, then why is it that these gases could always exist? That makes Aquinas relevant all these years after his death. Some 750 years after his death, you could still advance his argument without appearing foolish. Again, like Anselm's argument, it's based in natural theology, not revealed theology. It's based on argument, which is why you find Anselm and Aquinas in philosophy textbooks, because they argued. They didn't just say, we have to believe it, it's based on faith. No, not at all. Interestingly, Aquinas did not accept the argument of his fellow saint, his predecessor Anselm. He said, with Anselm's definition of God as a being than which none greater can be conceived, he said Anselm had merely defined what God is. This is the essence of God, but he hasn't shown that he is. You can't go from whatness to thatness. You can define the attributes of something that doesn't imply that it exists. But notice that that's a difference that's predictable based on all we've been studying to this point. Aquinas, being an empiricist, wants to see sensible evidence. He sees a world and he reasons backwards to the existence of a cause that caused this world. That's empiricism. Anselm says no need of empiricism. There's the rationalist idea. We have a definition, and that definition is a priori. God is a being than which none greater can be thought. By the way, the best definition I've ever heard of it. I'm tired of words like supreme, perfect. These they're used so often they attain a dull edge over time. But a being than which none greater can be thought is something he thought about in order to come up with that definition. And indeed, it's intuitively plausible that God would equal a being than which none greater can be thought. You can't, if it's God, you can't think of one greater. Now you can argue later that, as Hume and others have, that doesn't imply that just because you've had the thought that such a being exists. Granted, but Anselm is if he were to meet Aquinas, he would say back to him, we don't need actual experience, as the empiricists hold to. We have a definition, and we can spin from that definition a conclusion. So both of these philosophers are greats and will always be taught whenever metaphysics and arguments for and against the existence of God is taught. So those are St. Anselm and St. Thomas Aquinas. And I hope I've imparted some wisdom to you today about them. Bye-bye.